Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Purkayastha, for providing an overview of the chapter and sharing the main arguments. First of all, I'm really sorry because of the electricity failure here. I really have bad internet connections. So please pardon me if there is any disruption or I get disconnected. Based on my work with forced migrants, particularly trafficked population here in Pakistan, I will focus mainly on the theme of our panel, and that is the coloniality of power and biased policy making. So I will link it with what is going on here in Pakistan with particular reference to forced migration and trafficking in persons. And I endorse many points that Dr. Rochel has already shared. So I believe that when you talk about this particular form of irregular migration, that is trafficking in person, so what we see is that the assumptions or interventions are mainly based on the colonial era template. For example, the very definition of who is trafficked person, right? And that definition is mainly derived, as Dr. Rochel shared, in the TVPA, Trafficking Victim Protection Act of the United States. And that act basically defines a severe form of human trafficking. Whereas, our work here in Pakistan with, different populations who were exposed to the situations of trafficking clearly indicate that there is no severe form of trafficking, And as Professor Purkayastha said, that the problem is that when we categorize migration scholarship into different binaries or into fragmentations, for example, regular, irregular migration, like severe form of trafficking in person that is based on certain assumption about gender, race, etc. Secondly, particularly with reference to countries in the global south, because they are dependent on aid for various development projects. So what actually happens that they have to comply with the international standards to fight trafficking in persons, as Dr. Rochel also mentioned. Because every year, the trafficking in person report issued by the United States Department of State categorizes countries based on their performance in fighting human trafficking, ranging from tier 1, tier 2 watch list, and tier 3. So what then happens that instead of fighting, or instead of protecting those people who are actually exposed to the situations of exploitation on the ground, countries are mainly focused on improving their ranking in the international report. And many times the indicator or the guidelines provided in those international reports or categorization are not in line with the realities on the ground. For example, I just mentioned, like, the way a severe form of trafficking in person is defined in the US legislation that is actually driving the whole TIP report is not we actually observe here in Pakistan. We have like different situations, but practically to gain funding from donors, we have to follow those guidelines. And interestingly, for the international ranking, the main criteria is not that countries are effectively reducing the cases of trafficking in person, or they are able to address the real needs of those who are exposed to the situations of exploitation. But the real criteria to improve the ranking is that countries enforce the guidelines as given in the TVPA Act, whether they make any sense in those countries or not. So again, this is very problematic. Similarly,
May I
what
now
happens
ask
that
my question? So, because the question is addressed to all the panelists, whoever
It's
answers. The question I wrote in
yeah,
the chat is not decolonial praxis about, at
excuse me.
least in part, the will to political struggles, the embodied and the situated. I mean, when we talk about
Could we finish
Bula
listening to
Bhadro.
Dr. Yusuf?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but let me quickly first.
Can we reserve the question until Dr. Farhan is finished, please?
Okay.
So we will come back to the question.
Okay, fine.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So quickly, concluding my presentation. So what other problematic thing is that what we see is most of the time the interventions are driven by foreign donor agencies when we talk about addressing this issue of forced migration or refugees or trafficking in persons. So just to share you one example, recently, I visited a shelter in Pakistan, and what I observed that many of the interventions they are providing there for the rehabilitation of the victims, they are not really aligned with the needs of our local context. For example, the short-term interventions like the donor agencies, they are more interested in short-term interventions, whereas the structural conditions outside those shelters, they remain the same. So what happens that people who move outside the shelter, they again become vulnerable to repeated exploitation. So that's why we conceptualized or we highlighted this issue of trafficking in person on a continuum of violence. Because what we observed that instead of treating these different forms of human trafficking, be it like labor trafficking, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, they are actually interrelated. So it's very much possible that a person who is right now exposed to indentured labor, that person might, because of his or her position of vulnerability, it's very easy to exploit that person for the purpose of removing organs or for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And it really happens on the ground that people often go through these multiple episodes of exploitation. But on the other hand, our policies, what they tend to do, they actually tend to conceptualize or tend to approach these for different forms of exploitation as discrete forms of exploitation instead of treating them on a continuum of violence, on a continuum of vulnerability. So based on my experience here in Pakistan, what I argue is that without addressing the persistence of larger economical political structures that actually create and increase people's vulnerability to trafficking, humanitarian efforts to counter trafficking in person or to address their vulnerabilities are not simply enough. And particularly the type of rescues we observe here, which are mainly driven by organization from the global north, which are the core of humanitarian efforts, they do not solve trafficking because the underlying structure that create the vulnerabilities are not really addressed. So humanitarianism directed towards prevention and assurance of resources that prevent people from living in deeply insecure condition would be far more effective in the long run instead of making it that people are exploited and then we come to protect them. So instead of this, we should address those factors or those structural conditions that at the first lead people to the situations of exploitation and create their vulnerabilities. Thank you so much.
Much appreciated, Dr. Farhan. Thank you for emphasizing the interconnectedness of the status of individuals that are being trafficked. So that fits very well with Dr. Archil's presentation. So I will open the floor. Now there's a question from Dr. Bula.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
I'm just going to read the question. I sort of extended it to make it more clear. Is not the decolonial praxis about, at least in part, the will to political struggle, the embodied, the situated, and collectively shared struggles, often for life against the multiple forms of colonially proffered de-existence. My feel, Bandona has given an answer. Yes, of course, that is what should drive the other efforts to change institutions so that decolonial practices become the norm. Not something, but unfortunately, one of the classic country of being colonized is India, where this becomes addition in the higher education level, does not percolate to where the school level, because my understanding is if it doesn't percolate to the root, it's still a tree with a decorative fruit just on the top of it, but not at the bottom of it. My feeling on walking on decoloniality with special reference to India, that it's still hanging on a sort of plastic tree which is not rooted to the soil. So whatever work we do is not touching the fact that we are still under a particular type of colonial education, and decoloniality is very far from that. I mean, without knowing English, you don't get a job, really speaking, unless it's just a physical work in a very remote areas, etc. I mean, it's compulsory that and often our central government only advertise in English and Hindi. So the central government jobs are not even available to the regional people. I mean, recently we are having for election that special intensive revision. First, the forms came in English and Hindi. After a lot of protest, it became regionalized in the states the election is having. So it's a huge impact. And crores and people are living with it for the last 77 years. So, I mean, I'm asking the question because since I work on it, that what good is the work until and unless it is connected to the root, to the praxis, especially our generation. I mean, is Professor Sabelo there? Because I had this question after listening to Professor Sabelo. I don't know whether he's there or he has left for it.
Yes, I see him there. Dr.
Okay.
Sabello? Oh, yes.
Hello, Professor Pula.
Yes.
Greetings.
Greetings.
That's a very difficult question, but let me.
I didn't mean difficult way. I meant in practical ways of doing things. The more we discuss this, the more we are open to the, are responsible to tell other people how we can proceed in practice.
Let me address one aspect of it and leave the others for others. I remember in South Africa, such a question arose. Why was it that the decolonial debates and the decolonial struggles were confined to universities? And they were not percolating into secondary and primary schools. The answer did not come from us in South Africa. It came partly from Professor Mahmoud Mamdani. And I think the answer was that the curriculum, which is in secondary schools, in primary schools, the teachers who are teaching in secondary schools and in primary schools, in other countries, they are trained in the universities. Mm-hmm. So they carry the problem from the university into the primary and the secondary school. So it made sense to deal with them where they are spoiled. So that is one answer, which was given, that no, these people, they are not trained in primary schools themselves. They are not trained in secondary schools themselves. They are trained in the tertiary sector, where they imbibe the colonialities, and then they carry it to the primary schools and to the secondary schools. So it makes sense to actually deal with them where they get this colonial knowledge. So that one aspect which I wanted to bring forward as a practical example of how others think about it. I think the other aspects, they can be addressed by others.
Professor Savala, just one sentence. We hardly choose our jobs.
Yes.
We have to be applying for the particular one we are qualified for, and if then given. So even if I want, I cannot get a job in a primary or secondary school. I'm more qualified or less qualified than those particular qualifications. So it's a very unpleasant matter that even if I want to leave the university and want to teach in a secondary or primary school, I won't be allowed. That is the bad part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Bandana, please.
Yes.
Yeah, so in the interest of, sharing a strategy, Professor Bhodro, what we have started doing in the US, because US has a lot of this, including completely wiping out sociology
No, of
at the
course,
college
of course.
level and what will be taught in the curriculum, because the curriculum is locally defined and so on. We have tried very hard at different professional association conferences to bring in at least a few local teachers and run workshops on these.
Okay.
It's not the solving of the whole problem, but it's a recognition of the problem and trying to kind of recreate some thought leaders who can go back and then work in their own spheres. I know this is not easy work, so I don't mean to minimize that, but I'm just saying this is a strategy that I just wanted to share.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bandana. Dr. Archil, go ahead, please.
Thank you
He
very
has to
much.
be unmuted.
Yes.
He's still muted.
Thank you for the question. I really very much situate also or relate to the problem of even the language. That we have to use a particular language to be able to participate in a global economy, for example, for labor, for example. That is, in fact, a double-edged sword in the case of the Philippines, because our having been colonized by the US has brought about a very English-speaking population, which is good because we can participate in the labor market. But it's also, in the bad side, it's in fact one of the very factors that fuels trafficking in persons in the country, because we can easily converse our children, our families who are actually feeding their children to pedophiles are very much able to converse with these pedophiles to be exploited sexually, especially online. So that's a double-edged thing. I call also this, in fact, you were talking about the problem of education. I did a book chapter sometime in 2024, although that's like 4 years in the making during the pandemic, on global citizenship. And one of the points that I cited there is the fact that our neoliberal education is actually preparing our students, the products, like in an assembly line, for purposes of global competency, but not really to engage critically with the dark side of globalization. And that's something that we really need to be guardful or be very cautious about. Now, on the praxis side, I must be honest that I'm not really a decoloniality scholar per se. I just looked at certain intersections between liquid modernity, which is the one that I'm really studying on, what I did in my master's, with decolonial thinking. So I did a decolonial reading on trafficking in persons. And on the praxis side, I really look at the root of the problem. As far as I'm concerned, it's really on the consumerism that is consuming like practically the entire world, especially if the ones who will consume are flawed consumers, because they would later on become in their zest, in their, and what's this, in their excitement uh, to participate in the global economy, they market themselves and become the commodities. So they become the consumed. And for me, this is something that we should address even at the very basic level, from the family to the very agents of socialization. And in my upcoming project, book chapter with the Philippine International Studies Organization, I'm going to be able to, I hope to be able to employ, as what Dr. Bandana earlier said, employ Rizal on his concept, his essay on how the Spaniards actually demonized our ancestors for being indolent, when supposedly our ancestors were not indolent. They relaxed, they rested after they have done what they need to do, their needed labors, without being too extractive. Did, they only got from the land what they needed, not surplus. It was the Spaniards that actually took the labors from them and claimed as their own. And so, who would want to work when your labors could not go to you or your family? And yet, we were demonized as, or our ancestors became demonized as lazy. So, this particular point, and I call that in Filipino, it's called pagtitimpi. It's it's taking what you actually just need, not much. It's not extractive. And I believe that's part of the decolonial praxis. One last thing on human rights, because there are three major frames on trafficking in persons, and that's, of course, we have the criminalization or punitive bandwagon. There's also the victim centric frame, but this is resource oriented. It taxes the the countries of origin, and still it is victim centered, meaning it's supply centric. It doesn't address the matter on demand. There is, of course, the human rights frame, but in the paper I also interrogated, and I made use of Maldonado Torres's critique of human rights. Who is the human in human rights? Is it the white human? Is it the white human making the black wear the white mask, in Fanon's terminology? So that's what I would like to share in the discourse. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very stimulating discussion. Caroline, you have a question, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to chime in on Professor Bula Batra's statement. And yes, definitely we need to think more like activists. We need to link up and be in dialogue with activists. And I think especially in the global north, the decolonial movement there must be in dialogue with activists in the global south and understand what they're striving for. Otherwise, as Risa just said, it's really a strong danger that especially white people in the global north who try to decolonize, turn it into an elitist ivory tower movement that's far away from actual social change. So I think that is really important that we do that. On the other hand, activism can kill. So the student that Justin was talking about, who was also my student, unfortunately got shot and killed because she was misidentified, or just uncaringly, wrong place, wrong time, was killed because she was misidentified as a part of the armed forces, when I don't think she belonged to that, but she was definitely either grassroots org or possibly activists. So it's like a spectrum of these people, from armed forces to the more moderate people who just go to demonstrations, to people who work for grassroots organizations. So it can also kill. One can go to a lot of protests and endanger oneself, endanger one's students, which a lot of people here in the Philippines are doing, and make posters and write placards and spend a lot of time and the government just kills, and then no actual social change happens, and the government vilifies us. So we think, yeah, just chiming in. Um, so we must learn from and align with activists and become activists, and we must also be strategic and think how can we reach those people who actually can make social change. So I was brainstorming with Dr. Fatima, and she had some wonderful ideas. So we hope to keep this discussion going on how can we actually make and implement social change that decolonizes the political, economic, and other relations, and brings about true social justice for everyone.
Yes, Caroline,
Thank,
I do agree, but there's one point. I have this uneasiness about this having global north, global south, the binary, because I don't think every country in global north are actually equal. And I would not consider Poland with the United States or any other East European countries. And I would definitely say that we should need North South dialogue, but not on this binary understanding of North South. We need North North dialogue, we need South South dialogue, because just North South dialogue won't really actually materialize. Because at, at the same point, we need to extend that how many we can actually have in terms of in favor of decoloniality really. So this we need to have. I congratulate you and Fatima for organizing this, and I'm trying to attend this, though it gets late at night, but I'm trying to attend it as much as possible so that we can going through this particular understanding and its deep consciousness, so that we can act, because it's very important that we act. Just because we are going to discuss is nothing going to change. So at one point or others, all of us, this way or that way, have to act within the small corners we can touch. That's what I keep believing, and got to do it. That's my answer to me, my question. I got to do it.
thank you, Dr. Bulla.
Thank you.
I have two questions that I'm burning to ask. One is very specific to Dr. Archil, and the other is for the other panelists. Um, the question that I want to ask Dr. Archil is, you mentioned in your paper the white man's burden, and I guess the 2.0 updating that with respect to white men and trafficking and the demand side. What I wonder is, even at the time Rudyard Kipling was writing about the white man's burden, imperial feminists were actively advocating for imperialism. And now we have humanitarian feminists saying drop bombs on people so we could liberate women. So the one question to you is, in as much as it is important to identify the male patriarchal, I don't know how to frame it, aspect of trafficking, what role do white feminists play? I mean, like, they've always played a part in the trafficking. Here in Canada, the trafficking was legalized through the domestic worker scheme. And women from the Caribbean were brought up to work in white women's kitchens and clean their floors and take care of their children. So that's one question, if I could ask you to comment on that. And for everyone else, the stalking horse to me in all of the papers that I read and the presentations comes back to Dr. Archil's comment around liquid modernity. And the stalking horse is that on one hand, the state is being dissolved, and on the other, our narrative, our discourse does not seem to be able to bring these two opposing dynamics together very well. So I just wanted to put that last question out generally for everyone, but Dr. Archil, the first question, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I I actually did not look. I must admit that I did not look on like the feminist movements per se. What I did with the feminist discourse here is more on sex work, whether or not it is something that, the philosophy behind sex work, because of course this is about sex trafficking, more on sex trafficking. But the thing about feminist movements is that usually white women's part in feminist movements tend to be more of the there. I don't want to say that there is, and like all the time, the binary, but usually at the beginning, there tends to be the the women of privilege who get to say, who gets to have a say in feminist movements. That's true in the suffragette movements across the globe. Uh, and in the case of colored peoples versus, for example, the white women, the privileged women, we also see a kind of divide. So I traced in my dissertation when I did my master's years ago. I came across the history of the white slave trade, because obviously we talk about trafficking in persons as modern day slavery. So I traced the history of that, and there's even that misconception that by white slave trade it's white women that were the only ones objectified for purposes of sexual slavery, which is because, well, allegedly for the colored peoples, the colored women's, they were meant for labor. But as you mentioned, trafficking that happened before, the slavery that happened before, could not be neatly placed in categories of, white women are just for sexual exploitation and colored women are just for labor, slavery, because there will always be those intersections. There will always be sexual exploitation of colored women, and not just white women. But there is always the privileging in the language, in the usage of the phrase white slave trade. And it turned out in literature that it's not really just white women who are enslaved for sexual exploitation, but all other women itself. So yeah, I didn't want to fall into that particular it might be not so defensible, like what the role of white women did in this particular discourse, but it's really women. It may come to a point of dividing where there may not be a need to divide, but that it's really a plight that women share regardless of color. I hope I'm making sense somehow.
Yeah, no, no, yeah, thank you. Yes, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any takers for the issue of liquid modernity? I think it's Dr. Archil makes a brilliant point in grounding her paper in that. And as I read through the papers, it seemed to me that that's I don't know, it seemed to be like a stalking horse through all of the papers and the presentations here. We talk about globalization, we talk about the nation state, and yet these are opposing tendencies. And I'm wondering if our narrative, if our theorizing has caught up to the dissolution, the porousness of the nation state that brings people from one place to another, and just shuffles them about like cards on a deck.
Maybe let me come in, Tamari, and try to address that as I also share my departure points, because I want to leave. I think when I listened to all the presentations and also participated in the presentations myself, One issue which emerges poignantly for me is that we need maybe to reconceptualize knowledge itself.
Mm.
Our conception of knowledge. Obviously, there is the Foucauldian idea of knowledge power dynamic, which a lot of people have embraced. But it looks like from the colleagues and from what I've been listening for years, not only today, it looks like we need to redefine knowledge. Not knowledge as power, but knowledge as life. We need to go back to this idea of knowledge to live by. I think it was Leila Gandhi or something, if I'm not mistaken, who introduced that idea of a knowledge to live by. Knowledge which was within communities, knowledge which was with the people, knowledge before it was what is the word, encrypted, extracted, encrypted, and made into an instrument of power, of domination, of exploitation. Before, knowledge was encrypted into expertise, something known by a few people, something which is hard to access, something which is kicked from society up and up into the stratosphere for only few to access. And when I grew up myself, I grew up in rural areas. I knew all the trees, including their names. I knew all the rivers, including their names. Before I went to a modern school, I knew the mountains. I knew fruit trees and those ones which were poisonous. I knew so many things. Knowledge was with us. It was not something which was difficult to access. My mother was my first teacher. My grandmother was my teacher. My father was my teacher. There were so many teachers. Elder sisters were teachers. Brothers were teachers. There were bullies and the teachers at the same time. So I'm thinking about that time when knowledge was not expertise, and there was still this time when knowledge is a commodity, which if you have no money, you don't access it. That I think in decoloniality, we need to rethink and redefine knowledge itself. That's one issue which I wanted to say. The second issue, which might address the issue of liquid modernity and the problems of the methodological nationalism and the nation state. I'm going back in my reading to literature on connected histories, which I think also comes from Southeast Asian scholarship, the issue of connected histories. And I link that with I think it was picked up by Guminda Pambra in that slim book on connected sociologies. And also, it is also highlighted by Sylvia Tamale, the Ugandan feminist, when he talks about we must connect the dots of racism, enslavement, imperialism, colonialism, patriarchy, sexism for our children to understand. And that, to me, I just oppose it with the colonial way of knowing, which is about paradigm of difference, differentiating things. That for us in decoloniality, really, it is about connecting the dots, connecting the histories, and connecting the experiences. And I think that way we will escape this issue of the nation state. And I think it was, we also talked about the issue of what forms of dialogues should we engage in. I think we need to engage in both horizontal and the vertical dialogues. And the horizontal ones being dialogues amongst ourselves. dialogues among academics and the communities. And of course, the major problem is that maybe because of colonialism, we seem to be privileging vertical dialogues, the global south and the global north, and we ignore our own interactions. And I was recently reading the work of Bell Hooks, particularly her book "Feminism is for Everybody: Passionate Politics," and it also goes back to Bula's question about the communities and the intellectuals and the academics. That in that book, Bell Hooks talks about that earlier on, the feminist communities, they were engaged in groups of conscientizing each other. Before the debate moved into the academies, into women's studies and into all this, and before it also got encrypted in terms of language to the extent that some could no longer access it. That and she suggests that we need to go back to that grassroots dialogues. So I think that also might be an important aspect. And I wanted to conclude by talking here opportunistically, of course, about also the work which I am doing now. I'm actually in Canada now, at the University of Calgary. I'm just 5 months, if not 6 months old here, having come from University of Bayreuth in Germany, and I have a Canada Research Chair, a Tier 1 in pluralistic societies. Is entitled Pluralistic Societies, Epistemic Pluralism and Ecologies of Knowledges. And I'm actually laying the foundation for that chair. And one of the aspects is what colleagues here spoke about, the issue of migrations, which is one aspect. But my own approach, my own attempt to deal with it is to deal it from an epistemological point of view, particularly to look at the what I call migrant epistemic communities. And the migrant epistemic communities to me are very attractive in the sense that we need to study what do they bring to the academy, what do they bring to the societies in which they arrive. So the research part of the chair is to deal with that aspect of migrant epistemic communities, including migrant academics who come from other countries, who introduce new courses, who introduce new ways of thinking, we introduce decoloniality and other ways. Here we need to engage with them to understand what exactly do they bring here, as well as those outside the university, that these people do not only come as a problem here, they also come with the knowledges and the ways of doing things which might be different. And if we want to cultivate pluralistic societies, we need to have a different approach to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sabello. Caroline, I'm sorry, I want to thank everyone. I do have an appointment at 1:30, and I wonder if I could turn the chairship over to you for the conclusion.
Thank you so much. Actually, yeah, we should conclude because we're about over time and it's very late at night for some of us. Before we conclude, are there any very urgent last minute thoughts? Yes, Archie?
Thank you. On just the matter on liquid modernity, I just hope that we, the call of the hour is really to know, like, there are many residues, or not really residues, but, there are still the creations of the so-called solid phase of modernity, and one of them is the nation state. And that this is just one of those things that actually perpetuate the coloniality of power. And in the current phase that we are in, the liquid phase of modernity, there are other fluid factors and actors that come into play that could either entrench the coloniality of power, but as a double-edged sword, could also be a way to break away from the coloniality of power. In the Philippines, we also have this so-called, and I did a paper on this like a few years back, the liquid consumerism of disinformation, and with the so-called infodemic. And Dr. Sabello earlier talked about the importance of knowledge and reclaiming that knowledge. And hopefully, when we talk about AI now, also the humanity in knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, hopefully with the dangers of infodemic, which is a fluid problem amidst, solid fixtures of solidities that remain to entrench the problem of coloniality. We hope that we, the decolonial, the thinkers on decoloniality, would be the info medics to the infodemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Archel. So let me conclude. So first, I want to say I very much share the sentiment of a lot of speakers that we must tackle the power relations. We must think more like activists and think how can we dismantle power relations. Dr. Fatima and me are actually planning a conference, which you're most welcome to speak in or organize sessions in, all of you, if you would like. We'll be in touch with more details later, but if you have some ideas, please write any of us now. That is focused on dismantling of imperialism, dismantling the coloniality of power. And we also want to think about some smaller meetings where we strategize about how can we decolonize and dismantle all these power relations and how can we get the global north. I have some longer concluding remarks which come from our introduction to the special. I'll paste them in the chat because everyone is tired. You can read them in the chat if you want. But yeah, that's the general focus. Global South should lead decolonization or marginalized thinkers in the global north, but not privileged Western, privileged white scholars. And we really need to dismantle power relations and bring about economic, political justice for all on the planet. With that, I would like to thank Fatima Sajjad for giving us the space and hosting our special issue introduction. And Fatima Sajjad, would you like to say some closing words? And thanks so much for all the speakers and others.
Yes, and thank you so much, everyone. It has been such a wonderful conversation, and thank you for joining us. We look forward to continued connection because this is not an individual work. This is a collective work. So we are really looking forward to building connections and continue these conversations. Thank you so much.